The 2024 U.S. Chess Championships are complete, and we have repeat champions with Carissa Yip winning the women's section and Fabiano Caruana winning the open section. So without further ado, let's take a look at one of Caruana's games from this event. I found this one particularly interesting as someone who's a big fan of the French defense. Caruana chose a sideline against the youngest Grandmaster, Mishra. And typically in this position, you're going to see f4 or knight f3 is normally going to be a transposition into the two knights French. But Caruana had something completely different in mind, aiming to play against the standard c5 break. In the French, black is always trying to break up the center in order to make that e-pawn weak. So, with knight c to e2, we're able to support the center and assure we can capture back with a pawn. And that is normally the aim with the French. So let's see how we can continue here. Knight c6, and this is already a critical moment in preparation. When I'd analyzed this position before for students, I was considering moves like a3, which can be seen in the advanced French in many variations, to be able to play for b4 expansion, as well as knight f3, which was played in the game, and f4. My students have had a lot of success by playing this rare sideline, and that's why I was so happy to see Grandmaster Caruana employ it with success. If f4, I feel like white's trying to do too much. You're never going to be able to fully control the position, as black is going to be able to exchange in the center, and at some point it's critical to play for an f6 break to gain counterplay. So in this case, f6 can be played immediately, and after knight f3, it seems like white's getting a little bit of something with this bishop h3 pressure. Optically, looks very good. But the major issue here is after c takes d, you can't really grab the e-pawn and expect to have full control of the position. It's really blowing open, and after queen b6, black already has the better of it, as their main problem in the French defense, that bad bishop, the French bishop, if you will, is into the game. So coming back to this sideline, if you don't grab that pawn, we end up needing to capture back with a piece, and black's doing completely fine here, as you need to defend that e-pawn. You're relocating the knight to a better square to pressure the center, and then you have the plan in the long term to zigzag the bishop once you've defended the e-pawn in another way. So that's the typical line that's seen in the database here. With f4, Caruana opted for the more solid knight f3, and after bishop e7, you have choice of plans. a3 has definitely been played before with some success for white, but in the main game, g3 was opted for, and this is kind of an extended King's Indian attack structure. After castles, we see another move that's often seen in the King's Indian attack, h4. And it's nice as it is securing a critical square for the future to be able to launch an attack from, and potentially we could be pushing that pawn further in the future in order to soften up the king side for an attack. So black really needs to be on point here. White's already showing aggressive intentions for this big attack on the king side. The best defense, offense here. So how can we generate some play? In the last video, I recommended once you reach a position, say out of your comfort zone, out of the opening where you're playing natural moves, you need to compare 3 candidate moves start with the most aggressive, work your way down. So if you're a pause your video type of person, this is the part where I'd recommend start pausing the video each move to figure out what you would do. So in black's case here, it's very natural to play a move like Queen B6, and I think that's where you can really get into trouble in this type of position, as that French bishop is going to have a lot of difficulties getting into the game. So you need to be considering the two most forcing moves in the position for black, f6 and c takes d4. And Grandmaster Mishra started with c takes d4 and then f6. And you love to see the aggressive play, as you got to have it in these positions in order to justify the cramp. So here, e takes f6, and normally I wouldn't strongly consider this next move for black. Bishop b4 check was played, and this is mostly because you've got your bad bishop that's struggling to get into the game, and you've got your good bishop. And this concept is based off of activity and endgame. So this pawn is cemented on a dark square. So in every endgame, this bishop would be able to attack. Whereas our pawns that are cemented in the center, our bishop will only ever be able to defend those pawns. So good bishop counterpart, bad bishop counterpart. And this is a frequent misnomer in chess when I'm working with a lot of players, that they think it's all about the activity. It's about the endgame. So here, bishop b4 check was played. Knight c3. And here, if black wanted to solve the majority of the problems with that bad bishop on c8, the capture queen takes f6 followed by e5 is a good way to do it. But you may not want to have to deal with that isolated pawn, so I can understand the hesitation here. So in the main game, knight takes f6 was played, and it's not a big deal having a single weakness. It's a principle of two weaknesses. So let's keep it going. Bishop g2. Here, I feel like we should be aiming to apply a bit more pressure with knight e4, gets the rook active, keeps an eye on c3, but after castles, understand that white gets a lot of compensation for this pawn snatch, and gotta say, I prefer white in this position. This activity is going to be very easy to generate. The bishop has multiple good options, including going to g5 with the tempo on the queen, and with this rook on the open file, it's hard to move the bishop. The bad bishop makes it even worse, keeping this rook out of the game. So for a pawn, you're getting quite a lot of compensation here. So coming back after bishop g2, bishop d7, castles. And there's that zigzag plan to finally get the French bishop into the game. And this is often seen in the Stonewall Dutch as well, which has that same pawn structure, except we've got a pawn on f5 in those variations. Here we question, where is the most active square for the bishop? And this is where we can see that thinking process in motion here. If you've got d2, e3, f4, and g5 to choose from, the majority of these moves are passive. Placing the bishop on d2 makes little sense, as it blocks squares from the queen and takes defense away from our d4 pawn. Bishop e3, also, when a bishop is doing a job that a pawn could do, bishops are meant for greater things. So the two active moves are bishop g5 and bishop f4. If we place the bishop on g5, black is very likely going to play a move like h6 to say, hey, are you interested in trading your bishop in the open position for my defensive knight? So in this case, bishop f4 makes a lot of sense as we break down the thinking process. And at that point, we only had really two moves to consider to finish minor piece development. And here, bishop h5. A little bit of pressure on the f3 knight. So before black can coordinate against our d4 pawn, simply break the pin. And after bishop d6, what's the best way to keep tension in this position? The only weakness is the e-pawn. So we need to play against this actively. Well, if we're going to trade, we trade on our terms, knight e2, where if the bishop is captured, our knight redeploys to the excellent f4 square, hitting the h5 bishop as well as the weakness on e6. So knight e4, trying to shut down the e-file. Queen e3, prophylaxis against any potential sacrifices or any nonsense. More pressure is building. So the f3 knight could fall, making our d4 pawn weaker. So one move threats, one move solutions. Rook a to e8. Black is preparing to blow open the position with e5. So now's a good time to play against that idea. Knight e5, grab, grab. Knight takes d4. And this, even though we're grabbing a pawn in this way, likely the better way to go was the simplification, this route, where we still have the knight on the board and we're going to get an endgame similar, except black has more options. After knight takes d4, the second reason I chose this game was the endgame technique is quite excellent from Caruana in this game. So the opening itself, white didn't get too much from. You had surprise value. The reason I like it is black has to play aggressively and accurately, whereas white can just make natural moves. So it places pressure on the opponent quite quickly to know what they're doing in a rare sideline. So it's good for surprise value. But now we need to make the most out of the position. Rook b4, we're hitting a weakness, and Grandmaster Mishra makes very simple move, rook e7. But this is one of the 2 points in this endgame where we could play a bit more actively, which is very difficult to find, especially when you're playing against one of the best players in the world, and you feel just a little bit of pressure on you. So here, an idea like rook f5 is quite playable, as, say for instance, bishop takes e4, we have queen b5, and looking to trade queens, placing some pressure of our own on the b-pawn. We know the pressure is about to mount in this position, so finding the optimal way to give us counterplay. You cannot sit passively as pressure will continue to build. That's worst case scenario for you in this type of endgame with an inferior pawn structure. And black has the inferior pawn structure as there are 3 pawn islands versus 2, and the chances of problems on the e-file are very high with bishop takes e4 coming shortly. Rook e7 was played, which is quite natural. After bishop takes, pawn takes, queen d5, hitting the a2 pawn, defense. Now e5. So white needs to optimize against the e-pawn. Queen e3, keeping an eye on a7, so another natural move to defend that. Rook e1, everybody's invited to the party here. So now it's a game of how can we continue to improve? You don't want to rush the move f4 to add more pressure, as the king is wide open in that scenario, and we need to calculate the guarantee success and the trade down. You say all the rooks come off the board, and your f-pawn's not there, the chances of a draw in this queen versus queen ending quite high. So, slow, steady improvements. Flexibility. Queen e2. This is definitely the most flexible square available to the queen. Queen c5. And now, in order to make f4 work, we've got to alleviate the pin. And where is the safest square for the king? g2. Very likely black could play queen c6 or queen d5 in the future. So king h2. And after rook d8, finally f4. Queen c3. Here, white should likely go rook e3 first in order just to see how black is going to react in this situation, because a move like queen d2 is met strongly by f takes e5, and we've won a pawn, but we're back in this blockading situation. In the main game, Caruana played queen g4, and this is, I would say, the critical moment of the endgame overall. This is black to play and hold the position. So take your time here and definitely start with the most forcing moves first. So black played a passive move, and that's what cost him the game at this moment. Okay, so hopefully you took some time to try to figure it out. And the key idea is a deflection idea. We need to play h5 in both critical variations. So h5 immediately is going to work, but it's harder to consider. Say h5, check, takes, and the main motif is the threat of checkmate here if the rook is captured. And that's it. That's what holds it together. Is after rook takes f4, now the best white has is draw by perpetual check. And we have something very similar with rook d2 here, king h3, that critical move h5 to deflect the queen, and the same theme that we saw in the previous variation. But it was not to be. Rook d to e8, and this is where that thinking process that I keep mentioning in these videos is so critical. You've got to be thinking actively, you've got to be thinking aggressively. Is this passive move is the question mark. Rook 1 to e3, optimizing the placement of the rooks. Now, how can we add just a bit more pressure on that pinned e-pawn? We need the queen involved. Where's the best square for the queen? h5, keeping an eye on the e8 rook, as well as the e5 pawn, and after h6, because it's difficult for black to make a move, we begin to collect. And this is another critical moment. Pawn or rook capture? Well, in the event of a rook capture, this queen ending is going to be difficult to win, as our king is wide open, and queen endings, they really revolve around safety. So here, f takes e5. Now we need to find a way to get our pawn rolling forward. Queen g4, lining up with the x-ray on the g-pawn and getting ready to push on the e-file. With the threat of mate on h1, one move threats, one move defenses, and when you're up material, don't just trade down, simplify the win. Take away chances from the opponent. Queen e4, takes. Now, we're not in a hurry to push the pawn, as black's king will come in immediately. Patience, optimization, king h3. Get the king to an ideal square. if black trades, while the black king is dealing with the pawn, we will be collecting, and we're much faster. So rook d8, cutting off the king temporarily. There's another one. Check. And there isn't much that can be done here as white can collect. So we can lose a pawn here. The easiest is going to be keeping these two connected and pushing them home. So king g4. And finally, slow, steady improvements. And black had enough in this position and resigned. Hopefully you enjoyed this video showcasing one of Grandmaster Caruana's victories in the 2024 US Chess Championships. If you enjoyed it, hit that like button please and subscribe.